Welcome back, Chappelle. All right, so I know this seems a little bit weird because one of my classes might be like, "We got further than this, Mr. Terry. What are we supposed to do?" All right, well, look, remember we had pep rally on Friday, right? That really adorably awesome, very very cute pep rally that the Stuco girls worked so hard on. And shout out to those girls. Shout out to all of our girls that are in Stuco and stuff like that. Met the freshman class officers. Really looking forward to helping y'all out and being your moderator, but sometimes these things happen. We had 10-minute shorter classes on Friday, so we might have got like a slide or two ahead of this, right? So, but the big thing is, we left off in class talking about no matter what, no matter who you are, no matter where you were, we had our first quiz today. But we did leave off in class talking about the Minoans, the third time period in our 8-series Greek time period extravaganza, if you will. We talked about in our last class, we talked about the Neolithic period, or our last flip, we talked about the Neolithic period just being when the Greeks started farming. We talked about the early Bronze period being the first noticeable archaeological evidence of bronze-made tools and out. Sorry, I have a visitor now. Josie, come here. This is our other dog. This is Josie. She's currently trying to find lizards. Can you say hello? Can you say hello? Stop just staring at me and come here. All right, so, all right, but yes, this is Josie. All right, she's very, very sweet too, but she's just kind of a goof. All right, anyway, so now that you've met both dogs, but the big thing is we started talking about the Minoans most recently, right? We got through our early Bronze Age, and then we got into the Minoans, right? So in class, we looked at a couple of artifacts, right? We looked at the Phaistos disc, right? We talked about their writing system of linear A, and we also talked about how we don't know a ton about the Minoan people. We know that they have a huge historic and cultural impact on the Greeks because they serve as kind of the marquee very first Greek people, right? We looked at pictures of Kenosis, right? We talked about their legendary esteem as sea traders and actually being people of the sea. And we talked about their bull leaping, possibly religious, possibly sport activities. We're not really sure. We talked about how this is me busting backflips off of a bull, and then Mr. Wooderson judging me back here, just going, what are you doing? Now, anyway, so it's really, really awesome that you guys have been all along with this entire process, but we also talked about how they originated themselves off Crete, the Isle of Crete, and going forward, you've already been talking about these people just a little bit. Word on the street is that y'all been talking about them in Mr. Roddy's class, right? And in Mr. Roddy's class, for your mythology class, you've already started talking about this particular place, the Palace of Kenosis, right? The large-scale architectural piece that is actually on Crete that serves as both a great palace and a city home, right? That actually, we believe that this huge piece of architecture was so great that it actually inspired many Greek myth, right? A very famous Greek myth that we will talk about in this flip as well. Hold on one second. Let me get a timer out to make sure that I'm just not going to suck up the rest of y'all's weekend for my B period. Also, shout out to my B period. Graded y'all's first quiz so far. It's looking very, very solid. I was super impressed. A couple of good hundos. Now, going further though, the Palace of Kenosis is super famous because it's part of an important Greek myth, but it's also super famous because it served as the political center of the Minoan people, right? We believe it's home to the possibly human, possibly only myth, legendary King Minos, and we do also know that it was built in kind of the style of this labyrinth, all right? So here is Crete right here. This is where we believe the Palace of Kenosis was located, on the northern shore on the Isle of Crete, right? So they had several other palace sites, Malaya, Zakros, Phaistos, right? And the Phaistos disc right here is where we discovered that early evidence of their writing, right? This bad boy right here is named the Phaistos disc because it's where the earliest examples of linear A were actually seen. Now, going forward, though, the Palace of Kenosis, we do have some ruins. These right here are ruins of the Palace of Kenosis, right? And in class, we got a brief chance to talk about how the Palace of Kenosis served as kind of an architectural baseline for the Greeks, right? And how screaming at you from just this image alone, how the use of Greek columns is going to have its start in the Palace of Kenosis, right? And we also talked briefly about how, there are 3 particular Greek orders of columns. We talked about Doric columns, Ionic columns, Corinthians, which come much later, all right? Let's go ahead and disseminate that. That's why you had a little box over in your notes, over to the side, that these Minoan columns would kind of serve as an early example of Greek columns, and we took 2 seconds to talk about what Greek columns are and how you can tell the difference between them, mainly for them from their capitals, right? Their capitals being the top part, right? And these are kind of looking a lot like that Doric order column, but these are specifically Minoan columns due to the fact that they are wider at the top than they are at the bottom, which actually later Greek columns from the Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic period are actually wider at the bottom than they are at the top. So they're almost kind of like inverse, okay? But it still serves as a great piece of archaeological evidence and archaeological kind of, what's the word we're looking for? Foundational set going into the Greek culture, right? But of course, this being the palace of Knossos for the Minoans. And it's actually pretty impressive how much of the city itself we still have. Now, yes, the roof is now currently removed from it because it is a ruin, right? Because it's been ruined. So it is actually currently has no roof, but at least we can still see where some of the layout and the walls were, right? Which gives us this idea that we believe it was built in that labyrinth-like structure, right? That idea that it might have been built much like a maze, very, very narrow hallways, several large rooms, might have been hard to navigate for somebody who actually didn't know necessarily their way through it. But we do know that this is one of the central rooms of Knossos, this being possibly a throne room and or possibly a religious ceremony room, right? The big things that scream at you immediately, though, is look at the artistic decoration. These people were not dummies, all right? The Minoans were a very sophisticated civilization. They had a system of writing. They could produce very glamorous art, right? They had concentration. They were all located in one spot. They had intellectual activity, military activity. They had we said writing system, right? So this room in and of itself serves as a reason why the Minoans are important and why they get and deserve their own Greek time period, right? Why it is the Minoan period in the ancient Greek civilization, and that not all Greeks are Minoans, but the Minoans are a part of the progression of Greek civilization over time, right? So we also believe that this might have been an offering plate, this again possibly being a throne that to me looks exactly like a toilet. I don't know why, it just does. But then, of course, these beautiful frescoes. We'll come back to frescoes here in a second. Here's another thing, speaking of their intelligence, right? Some of y'all are looking at this, this just looks like some old rocks and stuff. All right, so, well, like, what do we think this is? Look at this. Look at these, like, kind of ditch-like structures, right? And I hear some of you screaming already. It's like, oh, Jamie's like, oh, man, maybe it's irrigation, right? Maybe it's irrigation. Could it be irrigation, right? We don't know. Actually, we do know. So Jamie is on point saying that it might be irrigation, but I also heard Aisha yelling in the back. It's like, oh, it looks like it could be plumbing. Well, Aisha would be right. Yes, the Minoans actually had developed plumbing systems, which is a big deal because some of you are like, we use plumbing all the time. It's not that big of a deal. All right, well, it's a huge deal, actually, because this is in the era of like 3,000 years before Christ was born. The idea that you could go and use a restroom and that stuff would go away is a very, very big and important concept, right? Due to the fact that from the years of about 500 AD, 500 years after the death of Christ, right, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, the fact that from 500 AD up until about 1750 AD, Europe didn't know what the heck plumbing was, but the Minoans were doing it 3,000 years before the birth of Christ, right? Or possibly 3,000 years. 2,000 years, probably more likely. But still, like, it's a very, very impressive thing. Like, plumbing's a big deal. Plumbing's going to come up a lot. It kind of serves as like a marquee of developing civilizations. Now, the Minoans, of course, with their plumbing system, but this is, of course, this is the big dog. This is what we believe that Knossos looked like when it was fully intact, right? When we believe, using the archaeological data that we have, we believe that this is what the palace of Knossos looked like when it was fully constructed, which could be housed over 1,000 people, and was absolutely massive, serving, again, as that political and government and cultural center of the Minoan civilization. And you can see the columns all around the edges, and you can kind of start to see some of these Greek architectural themes in their infancy in this area. Couple things missing from modern Greek, or not modern Greek, but other archaic and classical Greek architecture are things like pediments, which are also going to be very prevalent in the Roman society, which we will talk about later on. But the Minoans are a very cool, very, very developed people. The word on the street is that the Minoans might have even domesticated bees, right? They might have actually had a honey trade. They also, we believe that they grew things like date palm, and that they actually had traded with the Egyptians to get a hold of. We believe that they grew olives naturally from the area, and that is something that they actually traded off. And we'll talk about some other trade goods that they used to forage. That's the word I'm looking for. But this right here, also very important, that is the floor map of Knossos itself. You can see the major amount of walls. This is the courtyard area in the middle, and it does kind of have that labyrinth-like feel, right? Now, the Palace of Knossos is very important because there was a very special myth that was written about the Palace of Knossos and the fact that it was built in that labyrinth maze-like style. Now, this myth documented as being written hundreds of years after the fall of the Minoan people and after they really weren't a major civilization anymore, but their culture and the ideas of them endured regardless, right? They were such a famous group of people to the Greeks that the Greeks actually drafted a very major myth around them, including, of course, the Minotaur, right? I know y'all heard about this myth already in Mr. Roddy's class. Y'all been talking about like some stuff in mythology, which is awesome. Mr. Roddy is the man. He is absolutely killing it. Make sure you tell him I said that, all right? I like him. He's a good guy. Now, I know that you might have heard it, but for some of y'all that might have been checked out, let's just make sure that you know this myth going into it. We can study for him. We can study for this. This is one of those moments where these classes kind of tend to cross over, right? So the Minotaur, of course, we believe lived inside of that labyrinth, right? Well, how the heck did the Minotaur get there in the first place? Where did he come from? This goofy man-bull, right? M-I-N-O, of course, meaning bull, and then tar, meaning like centaur or creature, right? And so this half-man, half-bull, how did he end up in the home of where King Minos himself lived? Well, he's kind of like King Minos' stepkid, all right? So here's this very, very weird kind of thing that happened, all right? So King Minos' queen and wife, I believe her name was like, starts with a P. I can't remember. All right, not important. So anyway, Zeus apparently sent a bull out of spite to mate with King Minos' wife. And this is the child that she bore, right? He was under the assumption that it was going to be his child. Turned out that that was not true, and actually this creature ends up being born of his wife, right? So this is like King Minos' stepchild. So he is so embarrassed by this creature that he actually locks it inside of this labyrinth, inside of the Palace of Knossos. And his plan is to dump his enemies inside of there and allow the Minotaur to eat them. All right, now going forward though, he did have one legitimate son that he was super proud of. Guy named Androgeus, right? So Androgeus was King Minos' like golden boy, right? He was like, oh man, that's my son, that's my boy, right? Get after it. And he was so proud of him that he actually allowed him to go out and compete in the athletic games that were going to be taking place in Athens, right? Which was an area that apparently Minos, in this myth, controlled, right? Because here's the ultimate irony. Athens didn't exist yet, all right? When the Minoans were around and very prevalent, Athens was like not even a thing, right? They weren't really actually a part of the Greek sphere yet. So it's kind of funny because Athenians ended up writing the story, and they came up way after the Minoans anyway. But it also was really cool because it shows the lingering impact of that Minoan culture, and that they actually impacted Greece so heavily on a cultural sense that even later Greeks knew who they were, right? So, but anyway, so King Minos decides to send his golden boy, Androgeus, off to play in these games while he keeps his stepson, the Minotaur, at the house eating his enemies, right? So Androgeus goes off to fight in these games, and while he's in Athens, he is killed by the same bull that hooked up with his mom. Ew. Yeah, but he ends up dying, right? And King Minos is so furious about this that the Athenian government allowed his son to die. He demands that every 9 years they give up 7 men and 7 maidens, and that they have to go into the labyrinth to see if they can best his stepson, the Minotaur, right? And every single time they go in there, they end up all getting eaten by the Minotaur, and none of them ever actually emerge. Some people actually have theorized that this is the basis of the Hunger Games novels, right? So continuing forward, though, anyway, the Athenian king is distraught by this. The Athenians' king name is Aegeus, right? The king of the Athenians at the time is named Aegeus, and Aegeus is like, oh my god, year after year, I gotta keep sending these people off to go get eaten by this Minotaur in Knossos. This is awful. And this ends up weighing on him heavily, so heavily that his son, Theseus, sees how distraught he is. He's like, Father, you know what? I will go, and I'll kill that Minotaur, and then I'll rub Minos' face in it. How about that, right? And King Aegeus is like, I don't know. What if you die? I don't know how I'll handle it. I don't think I could live if you are dead. Josie, stop trying to attack the lizards. Sorry. Anyway, so going forward, Theseus tells his dad, he's like, well, look. Don't freak out all the time. Just wait for me, okay? I'm going to take a boat, and I'm going to take 2 colors of sails, right? I will bring, when I'm coming back, if the sails on the ship are white, it means I'm alive. If the sails on the ship are black, it means I have died. So you will know I have died before my body has arrived, right? So you'll at least have time to prepare yourself. And so Aegeus goes, okay, I'll wait for you. And he stands on the edge of this cliff, deciding to wait for the boat to come back. But Theseus sails off towards Crete to go fight this Minotaur, right? He is volunteering as tribute, yeah? Just like in the Hunger Games. Oh my god, yeah. All right, so anyway, continuing forward, though, he ends up landing in Crete, and he hops off the boat where he meets this woman. The woman's name, Ariadne, right? Ariadne is the daughter of King Minos, right? And at that moment, apparently, Ariadne falls madly in love with Theseus, right? Sees him as like, oh my god, Theseus, he's very handsome, right? So, falls in love with Theseus, and she says, oh, I'll make sure you kill the Minotaur. Here's a sword, and here's a ball of string, right? And it's a mythical ball of string known as Ariadne's string or Ariadne's yarn, and this ball of yarn is magical. And so as Theseus is going through the maze, he lays it down on the bottom of the floor so he knows where he's came from and where he's going, right? And as he works his way through the maze, Theseus tries to, tells Minos, I'm going to kill your stepkid, whatever. And Minos is like, ha 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 ha. The chances of you doing that are pretty slim. And even if you do kill the Minotaur, the chances of you finding your way out of the labyrinth are slim to none. But Minos, of course, doesn't know that Theseus has this special ball of string. So he works his way through. He ends up finding the Minotaur. In some versions of the story, the Minotaur is asleep and he stabs him to death. And in other versions of the story, he actually ends up fighting the Minotaur off. 1 second. I got to make sure my dog's not... Sorry about that. Now, anyway. So he ends up finding the Minotaur, he kills him, he uses the string to find his way back out. And as a gift or a prize, Minos decides, all right, fine, you did it, you pulled it off, have my daughter, right? So they end up going off to get married, right? And there's a lot of other versions of the story where some say that, Theseus didn't really like Ariadne that much. And then there's other stories that are he, abandoned her and stuff. But anyway, we're going to tell one of the other stories where basically they run off to this island right near Crete to get married. And they end up getting married and they party way too hard and they drink way too much. And then he accidentally forgets his new wife on that island as they're sailing back to Athens. And since he's looking around the boat and he's like, well, geez, where's Ariadne at? Oh my god, I had way too much fun last night. He forgets to tell the crew to make sure to put up the right colored sails, and they end up putting the black sails up on accident, and as they're sailing in, Aegeus, his father, right, sees the black sails, thinks his son's dead, leaps off the cliffs, and kills himself in the sea below, and that is why the sea to the east of Greece is known as the Aegean Sea, named after Aegeus, Aegeus, the guy that apparently killed himself because he thought his son had died due to Minotaur eating. So anyway, yeah, so that is the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, right? But it's really, really important to understand that the Minoan culture endured for that long, right? It just continued to go for that long and actually, worked its way into Greek mythology and culture, right? So some Minoan art is some of the biggest things that we have, evidence, actually, that we have. Interesting understanding is that some Minoan art actually depicts female priests, right? Which is a very, very underrated or very underutilized form of art that has actually been used in most of Western civilization. Typically in Western civilizations, you never see female priestesses, right? It's usually mostly male priests, right? So there's an interesting dynamic that some historians have theorized that there might have been higher rights for women in the Minoan culture, right? This right here being a male priest and this one being a female priest. And then also the fact that some of their major goddesses were actually female as well. This is their snake goddess, all right? So Minoans might have been a little bit more open to women having more rights in the community. We're not really positive, right? But other interesting thing, though, is that they were the very first Westerners to create these things, right, called frescoes. Frescoes are a very important form of art where you use wet plaster and wet paint, right? So the idea is that you take this plaster and you lay it on top of the wall, right? You lay it on top of the wall, and while it's still wet, you paint on top of it, so when it dries, it seals itself permanently into the wall, and it becomes something that can kind of stand the test of time, right? And so fresco is an extremely difficult form of art that even modern-day artists really struggle with. But the Minoans apparently had perfected this art form beyond a lot of different means and beyond what many of modern-day artists even had the ability to do, right? This, of course, being a very famous fresco from the interior of the Palace of Knossos, showing, again, a major theme of the Minoan society, that connection with the sea, right? Because they were traders, right? They were master shipbuilders, and we know that they had a prevalence trading in the area, all right? So this is another very important fresco. This actually shows, speaking of trade, an item that they would trade a lot and actually get a lot of things back for. This woman is gathering saffron, right? Saffron during their era was used to dye pigments or dye clothing, dye textiles, certain pigments, right? Now, we eat saffron in the modern era as well in like a saffron sauce, right? So anyway, but this woman is actually foraging saffron that would actually later be traded. This is a very, very famous fresco also from the interior of Knossos. And this is another interesting one as well. This is one of the Vilo cups, right? There are two of these gold cups that are actually discovered to be very, very, very living evidence of how intelligent the Minoans truly were. The interesting part about it is not this cup itself and the fact that it was made by the Minoans, it's about where it was found, right? It was found on mainland Greece, way away from Crete, right? Which means, wait a second, if they found it in mainland Greece, that means that there must have been people in mainland Greece to trade with, right? And those people that they traded with must have gotten this cup from them and then actually kept it as a very priceless piece of, I don't know, legal tender, I guess. All right, so, but anyway, this cup being discovered in mainland Greece means that there were people there to trade with. And it also coincides weirdly as the Minoans began to fall off, right? Because no one's really positive where the Minoans went, all right? But we do know that the Minoan civilization endured on for several hundred years after this. However, they were not nearly as powerful as they once were. And a lot of people relate this to the fact that this could have been due to a huge volcanic eruption. The mountain of Thera actually, we believe, erupted around 1400 BC. So there's a chance that that actually destroyed their crop yields and really destroyed their ability to actually trade. I'm not sure. Or there's another chance that these people called the Myceneans might have showed up and actually what? Murked a lot of them and killed a lot of them, right? Or actually challenged them in wars. Because we seem to believe that the Myceneans might have been a pretty militaristically strong culture, right? So the Mycenaean period is going to start when the Minoans begin to fall off. Now, we know that the Minoans and the Mycenaeans knew each other and traded, right? That's because we found that cup in a Mycenaean kingdom, right? So, where did these Mycenaean people come from, though? Why was it the Minoans that were so strong and the Mycenaeans came later? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the Mycenaean people actually migrated into Greece after the Minoan people were already prevalent in this area. The Mycenaeans, we believe, came from the grasslands of southern Russia, right? Now, southern Russia is very close to Greece in the modern era. Well, geographically speaking, close. Not like, you know, you're driving there super fast. But this is Greece right here, of course. This is Crete. There is Knossos. The Mycenaeans, we believe, are located right here on this southern chunk of Greece known as Peloponnesus, all right? Peloponnesus, or Peloponnese, all right? So the area of southern, the area of southern, no, stop it, what are you doing? The area of southern Russia where they came from is actually very close by, because here is the Black Sea right here in the corner, and so it's like right up top here. It wasn't very far to come from, but we believe that they migrated down to the mainland area of Greece, or Peloponnese, and they traded and learned a lot from the Minoans and actually became a more civilized society, right? But the most interesting part of the Mycenaean people is that originally when they showed up, they weren't as massively intelligent as they were by the end of it, right? Because there are two phases of Mycenaean history that kind of show their progression of intelligence, right? The first one is the shaft grave era, right? And in the shaft grave era, it's all about how they buried their dead, and it kind of showed how they were sophisticated, but not as sophisticated as the Minoan people were. But then later in the Quine era, right, or the Quine era right here, which means common in Greek, shows a massive escalation of how smart they became, right? Because the shaft grave era is all dependent on these things. And I know a lot of y'all are looking at this like, that's just some dirt, all right? Well, it has to do with how they buried their dead. Because this is what the shaft grave era looked like. Okay, so the shaft graves built by the Mycenaeans looked like, where are you at? Like this, right? So you would have like a tombstone-like structure on top, right? And then buried beneath it, there it is, buried beneath that stone could be a 40-foot deep shaft that went all the way down, and then the body of a person would be buried deep below ground and capped off with a big piece of stone. Almost like an underground coffin, right? And in that underground coffin, people would be buried with some of their more priceless goods, things that they thought, oh, maybe they'll want them in the afterlife, right? Some of the most famous pieces of artifacts found in some of those shaft graves include this thing, which is the death mask of Agamemnon, which for any of your parents that might be listening to this right now, have probably heard of Agamemnon from the Iliad. He's the guy that employed Achilles. Or also the Agamemnon story relates to the very strong Mycenaean ruler. And also this is just a very famous artifact, the death mask of of Agamemnon. Now, being dated at the time when they found it in the late 1800s, they thought the guy who found it was like, oh, this is going to be Agamemnon's. Probably isn't, but it's just a very famous artifact from the shaft grave era of the Mycenaean people. We also found military helmets in these shaft graves. These are made out of boar tusk, right? So wild boar, they would hunt wild boar on mainland Greece, and then would take their tusks off as they, once they slaughtered them, and actually line their helmets with them. But really quick, if they have rudimentary helmets, and then we're also finding swords and stuff in their shaft graves, that means that they might be kind of militaristic. They might be all about their military. But something happened, right? Something happened, again, as the Minoans fell, then we entered into this period, the beehive burial period, also known as the Common Era in Greece, or the Quine Era, right? And the Quine Era is really important because that was the development of the Greek language, right? The Greek language became very common and began to proliferate throughout the entire Balkan area. Also, we believe this is the time when the Myceneans probably went off and took over the Minoans, right? And when they took them over, they kind of culturally diffused all their great stuff into their society and became phenomenally more intelligent, right? We began to find frescoes inside of certain Mycenaean temples. We began to find pots that were being very, very well decorated and showing a great leap forward in art. And the most important thing is we began to see these. They stopped using those shaft grave burial systems and they began to develop these things. These are called beehive burial systems, right? So a beehive burial system would be when they actually dug a tunnel into a hillside. This is grass, right, on a hill, and they would carve out the entire internal area of the hill and line that internal area with stone. And then they would lay the dead to rest right here. And that way the door could be opened or closed and you could visit these people that were actually buried there at any time. Usually these were reserved for royals or kings, okay? So a king's body would be surrounded right here, and then surrounded with treasures that they wanted to bring with them into the afterlife. But that is very much more sophisticated than that shaft grave, right? Shaft grave was kind of primitive, and then the beehive burial system showed us a huge leap forward in the Mycenaean intelligence. Also, we saw another leap forward in their intelligence, that this was the boar tusk helmets that they were using. Then they started making armor completely out of bronze, right? That's a huge deal. You're not making it out of like pig teeth. You're now making it out of bronze, right? Showing their advancement in intelligence. And this is going to really key off when they start taking over most of the Aegean region. And that's where we're going to stop for today. I'll see you guys later on. Y'all have a good one.